Excellent. Okay, well, thanks, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thanks,
Mhm.
Joe, for being willing to record. Hi, everybody. I'm John Carlos Sr. I'm an attorney, and I'm the director of student legal services. I'm coming to you from 20,000 feet below sea level in a bunker. As you can see, I've got no, I'm not. But my office, Student Legal Services, we provide free confidential counseling, education, and referrals to all currently registered UCSD students. In other words, each and every one of you has a free lawyer. In fact, two free lawyers to come talk to you about any and all legal issues, questions, or problems that you might be having. So let's say you're going to move off campus and you want us to take a look at your lease, or maybe you were already living off campus and you want to make sure you get your security deposit back when you move out. Let's say you get a parking ticket. I hope you don't, but I feel like you just keep, I feel like it's impossible to park on campus and not get a parking ticket. I know I've got let's say you want to start a business. Let's say you get a speeding ticket. Let's say you have questions about family law. Whatever it is, you can come talk to us. It's totally free and it's totally confidential. My office, Student Legal Services, is located in the Student Services Centers, the same one as Croutons and Financial Aid. We're up on the fifth floor. Nowadays, you might not find us in there because we are doing a sort of a hybrid remote schedule. The best way to get in touch with us actually is to give us a phone call. You can also, of course, email us at sls@ucsd.edu. Um, but yeah, we like I said, we help students on all types of legal issues, questions, or matters. It doesn't have to relate to university or not. Although we do also help folks with student conduct charges and academic integrity issues. Another big thing that we do, if you just absolutely love this workshop, that by the way, there's no way I'm going to get through all of the next 50 minutes or so, but I'm going to do my best. My office does, we provide we run the Discover the Law program, which is a series of workshops, 30 to 40 workshops on about 20 to 25 different areas of law. That's offered in the winter quarter, so basically starting the second week of January or so, all the way through March. And what it is basically just a series of 1 hour workshops on different areas of law. I do a lot of them, as does Mary, the other attorney in the office. And we also bring attorneys who specialize in patent law or immigration law or other areas of law, and they'll come talk about their particular disciplines. It's totally free to do, and if you attend 8 workshops, you can add it to your co-curricular record. So particularly folks who are interested in careers in law, that might be something you might want to check out. We'll send an announcement about that in January. The single biggest issue that we see at Student Legal Services actually is folks who have questions about living off campus, and security deposits and repairs, and they hate their roommate and other things like that. Um, and so that's absolutely something we could help you with. And I sort of have this sort of regular presentation that, as I said, I'm not going to get through anyways, but I'm going to do my best. But I do want to sort of mention, I know that there are some, that some students have had particular concerns, maybe about their specific situations. And so what I would suggest is, if that describes you and you're willing to share whatever question or issue you might have, feel free to put it in the chat, and I will do my best to address it before we end today, which, as I understand it, is going to be at about 3 o'clock. Although I can probably stay on a little longer if necessary. But yeah, if you have any specific things that you want to make sure that I touch upon, let me know in the chat. And if not, feel free to just hang out and take notes, and we'll go from there. Generally, I provide this workshop. I can do it anytime, but of course I do it a lot in the spring quarter when folks are starting to look for housing. But hey, we all know what happened last summer. What a nightmare that was, that you all had to deal with, in terms of, particularly for folks who were planning on living off campus, and especially those who were planning on living on campus but found out they weren't going to be able to do that. Some of this is sort of chronological in terms of its relevance, but I'm going to do my best to, to cover it and make sure that it's applicable enough to you. But yeah, as I said, as I go through this and anything pops up, feel free to drop a question. Any questions you might have in the chat. Okay, so I'm hoping and trusting that you could see the previous slide, and that's me. Excellent, thank you. And so what I'll talk about, among other things, is what is a lease exactly. I'll talk about security deposits, which within the area of landlord-tenant law is the single biggest problem that students come to see us about. We'll talk about rights and responsibilities. Probably not. I probably won't get that far. And I probably won't talk about dealing with problems, although hopefully I can give you a tip or two. By the way, landlord-tenant law is very specific to the state and even sometimes to the city or county where it's located. And so keep in mind that this information is specifically about San Diego, California, basically. But absolutely specific to the state of California. Also, there's not a ton of statutes, in other words, written laws relating to renters' rights. There are certain ones that are very important that I'll surely be mentioning. But I point that out because most of the rights and responsibilities that you are going to have as a tenant depend upon the contract. And so it's really important for you to, before you sign the contract, know what you're signing. Number one. And number two, if you want to know, like, what are my rights? A lot of times I have to say, hey, let's look at your lease and then we'll go from there. So make sure you read your lease, make sure you understand it before you sign it. In terms of the basic idea of a lease agreement or a rental agreement, it's a contract for the use of property. A rental agreement is I, tenant, give you, landlord, money, and you give me a place to live, right? If it's in writing, it's called a lease. There are two types that we see of rental agreements. There are the periodic ones, that's the fancy legal terminology, but most of us know it as month-to-month leases. So basically, they last forever until one side tells the other side they want to terminate the lease. Okay, those are great, right? Because they're flexible. You can just terminate. You don't have to have a reason. But it works the other way too, and the landlord can terminate the lease by giving you enough notice. And so there's flexibility, but there's also, that can be risky. The other thing about periodic, aka month-to-month leases, is that the landlord can raise the rent, from month to month if they want to. Although there is a rent control law as of 2019 that does cap how much they can raise it by to basically a little under 10% right now, per year. So they can't raise it more than, I think it's 9.2% per year as of now. So the other type of lease that we see, which is the more common ones that students come to us for, are the fixed term leases. So basically it's anything longer than a month. So fixed term can be 6 months. Most of those we see are either going to be 9 months or a year. They're great because there's stability there, right? You got a place to stay and you know how much the rent's going to be for the next 12 months or 9 months or however long the lease is. But they do obviously require an obligation that you're committing to this contract for a particular period of time. In other words, you're stuck with it, right? And yay, the landlord can't just kick you out for no good reason, but that means that you also can't terminate the lease. And this is honestly one of the bigger issues that we see is we'll find that students won't like their place, won't like their landlord, or God forbid, they won't like the roommates. They'll find out that people have different rules when it comes to cleanliness or respecting sleep or whatever. And next thing you know, people want to move out. And if you have a fixed term lease, it's going to be hard to do that. So keep that in mind. Leases are legally binding and enforceable contracts. They're not easy to break, not cheap to break. And chances are you can't do it unless, again, as I said, a specific exception applies to the rules, or if there's something in the lease itself that specifically says you're allowed to break the lease early. some leases have early termination clauses. Okay, so I hope that's all useful. In terms of the components of a lease, what actually is included, you got the landlord, and the landlord, I mean, it's a general term. That can be, a landlord can be the owner, and if it's a house, if it's a townhouse, or if it's a condominium, then the owner is, might be an individual person. It could be that the owner has hired a property manager. And so maybe it's the property manager who's managing the property, and that's who you might deal with. And then for apartment complexes and sort of bigger developments, think, a lot of the places around UTC, those are going to be apartments that are going to be, that they're going to have that are going to have the leasing office on site. So that's what landlord means for purposes of this presentation. So it should have the landlord's name and their contact information. It should identify all the renters/tenants, and that renter tenant that's interchangeable too. Should indicate the start date of the lease as well as the end date. Should indicate how much the rent will be and how often it will be paid, which chances are it's going to be 1 month to the next. And then how much the security deposit, if any, will be. I assume at this point in your lives, if you've lived anywhere outside of your own home, that you will have paid a security deposit to live somewhere. If you're living on campus, I expect you paid a security deposit. And yeah, it's a big issue, as I said, so something that I spend a little time on as I proceed. Of course, that's not all you're going to see in a lease. Lots of other provisions in there. There's typically a paragraph that discusses assignment or subletting, aka subleasing. So an assignment or subleasing clause basically says, that the tenant is not allowed to, rent their portion of the, their interest in the lease to anybody else. And so, a sublease or a sublet, let's say you sign a 12-month lease, but 6 months in, you want to move back home. So you want to find someone to replace you for the rest of the 6 months. So you move out, they move in. Or actually, let me be more specific. Let's say you've got a 1-year lease, you just signed it in June, but you don't want to move in June because you want to go home for the summer. And so maybe you find someone to replace you, until the fall quarter starts, right? So maybe you try to find someone to move in and pay the rent for July, August, September. And then at the end of that, they move out, you move in, right? So a sublease is basically where you find someone temporarily to replace you like that. An assignment is actually the first example I gave, which is what I clarified, which is basically an assignment is, let's say you live in a place and then it's time you want to move out for whatever reason, you want to study abroad, you want to go home, and you find someone to replace you, and then that person stays until the end of the lease. That's an assignment, signing your right for the rest of the lease term to that person. So most leases say you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to assign or sublet without the landlord's prior written permission. Some actually say you're not allowed to do it at all. And in fact, almost all leases that I see, I'd say like 95% of leases I see have a restriction that either says you can't do it at all or that you can only do it with the landlord's prior written permission. So it's really important if you're signing a lease with a roommate who's planning to graduate in December, but the rest of the tenants are going to stay on until June, or if you got a roommate who wants to study abroad, because hopefully we're going to start doing that again. In other words, and be gone for part of the lease term. The only way that you're going to be allowed to do it is if the contract allows you to, and if you follow the steps that are required in the contract. As I said, most places say you're allowed to do it, but only with the landlord's prior written consent. Some places say you're not allowed to do it at all. One famous example is Costa Verde. You're not allowed to assign or sublet your place if you live in post-event. So people still do it anyways. It's not a great legal position to put yourself in, but again, understand uh, what um, what you're getting into with that. There's usually a late payment provision. And typically, what the lease will say, that rent is due on the first, and if it's not paid by the fifth of the month, then the landlord is going to be charging, a late payment fee of $25 or $75. So in other words, so that's what lawyers would call a grace period, right? You've got until the fifth to pay the rent. There's no law that allows you that grace period, though. So I want to clarify too that if the lease says rent is due on the first, and if it's late by a minute, in other words, if it's paid a day late or a minute late after it's due, the landlord is entitled to charge that late payment. So most leases will give you a grace period, 2 days or up to the fifth day of the month. But keep an eye out that because, like I said, there's no law that says that you're entitled to those extra days during which you won't get charged. So if it says it's due on the first and nothing else, then guess what? It's due on the first. There's usually an integration clause, which basically says, okay, it's usually a paragraph that says, okay, this is the entire contract. There are no other contracts or agreements out there. And if there are, they're superseded by this one. And it usually also says if you want to make any changes to this lease, those changes have to be done in writing and signed by all the parties to the lease. So that's important because basically it means that if the landlord promises you something, let's say you find the perfect place, but maybe it's not totally clean. So you want to make sure the landlord cleans it thoroughly before you move in. But that's not written in the lease. Guess what? That's not enforceable. So you want to make sure that whatever the landlord is promising is in the lease, and if it's not, you need to address that. Otherwise, it's going to be unenforceable. So keep that in mind. It can be a little tricky, of course, to negotiate with a landlord and to try to get them to make sure to include, that this promise or that promise. But this is where you got to advocate for yourself and step up and say, no, this needs to be in there because it's important. Okay, there's usually information about utilities. In other words, who's paying the water, slash sewer, slash trash, and who's paying the gas, electric, who's paying the internet, blah, blah, blah. Nowadays, most all those costs are paid by the tenant. I'm sorry to tell you. Didn't used to be like that. It used to be that basically just the tenant would pay. Well, let me say that the tenant would usually not have to pay for the water, sewer, gas, or water, sewer, garbage, which is one bill that the city of San Diego, if you're living in San Diego, sends. Nowadays, landlords pass that on to you. So I'm sorry, but it's in the lease. But it's important in terms of who's obligated to pay it. But I want to bring that up because obviously that comes into budgeting issues. If you find a place and it's at the limit of your budget, keep in mind that you might probably going to also have to pay additional charges to make sure the lights are turned on and that there's water. So yeah, there's typically lots of other legal mumbo jumbo. That's an official legal term right there. But I throw that in there because one common provision is an attorney's fees clause. That's a paragraph that says that if there's any disputes about this contract and we have to go to court over it, the losing party has to pay the winning party's attorney's fees. So that can get expensive. There are cases where the attorney's fees are millions and millions of dollars alone, not typically in landlord-tenant cases. So the good news is that that's not something that you see typically in landlord-tenant law. And in fact, in some leases, there's a cap that says, the legal fees cannot amount to more than $1,000, say. But keep in mind that if you're thinking about not paying rent because the landlord is not being responsive to your repair requests, or because you hate your roommate and you moved out. If a legal action follows where the landlord files a lawsuit to evict everybody, and you don't have a great defense for why you stopped paying the rent, guess what? You got to hire a lawyer to defend you in court. And if you lose, you might have to pay both your lawyer and your landlord's lawyer for the privilege of kicking you out. So, yikes. Make sure, obviously, that if you have a situation where you're looking at you're thinking about not paying rent, trying to get your landlord to act, contact student legal services first, so make sure to talk about the risks and rewards for taking a particular action. Okay. All right. Oral leases are binding. I just mentioned that because not everybody has a written lease, and that's okay, but it's also not advisable. Make sure that you read the entire lease. Contact us in March. We usually send out an email, and if you're looking before March, that's fine too. But that's typically, I want to say March, April is when most folks come to us when they have a lease and they want us to look at it. I've seen most of the leases out there, if you can believe that. So make sure to contact us. Free lawyer. I'd be charging you all $350 an hour if we were off campus. It's free. So what the heck, right? Might as well contact us. You're already paying my salary. Use it. Thank you, by the way. Ask for a copy of the HOA, the homeowner association, if they're applicable. For condominiums and for newer developments, there are homeowners association. A homeowners association, or HOA, is, as it suggests, a group of homeowners who own property in the particular development or condominium complex, and they sit around and pass rules about where you get to park, and if you can paint your door a particular color, or hang stuff out of the back of your on your balcony, or when to take the trash out. You want to make sure that you get a copy of those rules, because those are just as enforceable as the lease terms, and folks can get fined if they're violating the HOA rules. So make sure that you ask your landlord for a copy of any HOA rules or any community rules or regulations. Make sure the lease includes all terms. As I said before, you can add lease attachments if necessary. Might be a little harder for the big places like Costa Verde, or other big associations that have a pretty strict contract. And of course, most contracts nowadays are all online. So how do you make a change to that? But it is something where you want to reach out to communicate with the landlord to get any details ironed out. Also think about using a roommate agreement. This might be a very risky thing that I'm about to do, but I want to share a sample roommate agreement that we have at Student Legal Services, and I'll drop it in the chat. It's risky because we'll see if I can actually get back to sharing my screen. But anyways, if you go to our website, sls.csd.edu, and you don't have to do this now, but as I'm going to do it to try to share the form. But if you go to our website, you look under legal resources, and then sample legal forms and agreements, you'll find the following, and I'll share this in the chat, at least a sample roommate agreement. And basically, the agreement it's in Word form, which means, of course, you can also turn it into a Google Doc if you want. And what it is it's an outline for roommates to sort of establish what the rules are when it comes to renting a particular place. So you can identify who the roommates are, how much each roommate is paying in terms of their share of the lease, and how much each paid in terms of the security deposit, who's paying what, utilities. In other words, you can use it for whatever you need. It's I think it's a really good, at the very least, conversation piece, so that everybody understands what they're getting into. And part of the reason why this is so important is because there's a rule of law that applies in California, and I think other states as well, called joint and several liability. And that is a fancy way of saying that each tenant who signs a lease is responsible for the entirety of the lease obligations. So what does that mean? That means that if let's say you have two roommates, and December 1st comes up, and you pay your share of the rent, and one of your other roommates pays their share, but the third roommate doesn't pay their share, the landlord, because of this joint and several liability rule, the landlord can evict, in other words, file a lawsuit against not just the roommate who didn't pay their share, but everybody who signed the lease. And because of joint and several liability, the landlord can hold anybody who signed the lease responsible for 100% of the obligations. So that's why it's so important for you to know and get to know who you're going to be living with, because it's basically a marriage, folks. You're signing a contract and you are binding yourself legally to that person. So make sure that you have a good conversation before you move in, and make sure that you're comfortable with who you're going to be living with. And as more examples of joint several liability thing, it's not just financial liability. There's if you have a roommate who has a pet and there's a no pet policy, you can get in trouble for it, even if you're not the one with the pet. If you have another roommate who has an overnight guest, it happens. Significant others will move in or spend a lot of time. A lot of time, and many lease agreements will have limitations on how often or for how long folks can stay at a place if they're not on a lease. And so you want to keep an eye out for those. And yeah, if you've got if you have a roommate who sublets the place against the terms of the lease, or you've got a roommate who's got a significant other who's spending every night at the place, yes, you can get in trouble for it. A roommate agreement is not going to limit your responsibility in terms of protecting you from liability against the landlord. In other words, even if you have a roommate agreement that says, I'm only paying $500 as my share of rent, that doesn't stop the landlord from suing me for the entire rent amount that hasn't been paid. But at the very least, it's a written contract that you can use in the event of any disputes. And as I said, I think it's good to have just to avoid disputes in the first place. So feel free to check out the roommate and let me know if you have questions about it. Yes, definitely.
Question, yes. So the word agreement and the word contract can be a little bit intimidating. How would you suggest students I know that you sent a link, but I for some reason can't open it, but can it be as simple as typing it up, everyone signing it, writing it, everyone signing it? Or does it have to be a little bit more, I guess, formalized?
So I mean, I don't know what's going on my computer. I was gonna go look at the link and now I don't see it. And my screen is blank. Awesome. It doesn't really have to be anything terribly formal in that it doesn't have to have particular terms in it. But it is an agreement in writing, and that you're recording for purposes of any disputes or to clarify anything. Call it what you want it. If you are living with a person, with or without anything in writing, that's a contract, because you're agreeing to be with this person and you're agreeing to let them be there and for you to be there. So keep that in mind, that if you're living in a place with another person, there's there's sort of an implied contract there, even if it's not in writing, um, to be there. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do want to say, I mean, that um, you can call it a lease agreement, you can call it a rental agreement, you can call it a contract, whatever the case may be. But basically, it's just it exists, whether regardless of what. Is it? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thank you, John.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
No,
How about now?
no, I can't at least.
Weird. Yeah, my
I also cannot.
my Zoom just croaked on me. Yeah, I've got a blank space. Maybe if I exit and enter again, let me try that. Just to reboot Zoom. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because I don't, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to try to quit Zoom. If I disappear forever, I apologize, but I think I'll be right back. So hold on just a second. I definitely would want to mention, even though I don't have my, even though I can't show you what I'm looking at. First off, and chronologically, the first thing that typically happens when it comes to students looking to live off campus is, in addition, of course, to touring a place and looking at it, and of course also deciding who you're going to live with. One of the first things that happens is you fill out a rental application. The rental application is basically going to be asking you for background information. It probably is going to ask you for a social security number. And in the age of identity theft and things, that might make you a little bit anxious. But it's okay to give a prospective landlord your social security number if you have one, so that they can run a credit check. And that's presumably what they're going to do. Is run a credit check to make sure that you are not a risky renter. Now, of course, this doesn't always work out great for students because students probably don't have a long credit history, right? And most credit reports will have employment history and residential history, and lists of assets and debts and things like that. So that might be a challenge that you'll have, and it's something that you want to sort of prepare for by talking to financial aid, if you're receiving financial aid, to try to get documentation to prove that you are able to pay the rent. This is also a situation where a landlord might ask you or your roommates, if the landlord's not satisfied with the credit check and what your credit history specifically might be. This might be a situation where they might ask for you to provide a cosigner or guarantor. Cosigner or guarantor means the same thing. It's usually a parent or guardian who basically signs the contract and agrees to be financially responsible for the contract. This is tricky, and it's something that I try to suggest that students avoid doing. It is the landlord's right to acquire a cosigner. In other words, if they insist on doing it, you have to decide if you want to live there and have a cosigner. But as I said, the idea of the cosigner guarantor is that they're agreeing to be financially responsible. And that can get really tricky because of the joint and several liability rules that I talked about earlier. Worst case scenario of any sort of case that I've dealt with, I want to throw it out there, not to scare you, but to make you understand what I'm talking about in terms of responsibilities. I had a student come in, this was a few years ago. The student came in to speak with me because the student's mom co-signed the lease, and the student's mom was being sued because the student's roommate burned the place down. Yikes. That's how ugly it can get. So that's why I say it's a difficult position for you to be in if you don't have a lengthy credit history. But I would suggest do your best to talk the landlord out of requiring that you have a cosigner sign, because whoever the cosigner is, they're agreeing to be financially responsible for everybody that's on the lease. And some places will require multiple cosigners. So yeah, it's tricky business. So another thing that on the going back to the sort of credit issue, one thing that you might want to do before you start looking around for a place is go to annualcreditreport.com. Annualcreditreport.com. That's one word. And basically, annualcreditreport.com is a website basically sponsored by the federal government in conjunction with the 3 credit reporting agencies that exist. The credit reporting agencies, they're Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. They're basically the 3 companies that monitor credit, and they're so they're the ones that will have credit reports that again identify your employment history and your list of assets and debts and any credit, any court cases, that sort of thing. And so I would suggest go to annualcreditreport.com soon. You're allowed a free copy of your credit report from each of the 3 credit reporting agencies once every 12 months. And so, maybe get one from one of them right now, take a look at it, make sure there are no errors. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon for there to be errors in a credit report. And maybe have that even, made available to a landlord when you're applying for a place. So that's and another thing that I always hesitate to suggest, but that you consider is you might want to start looking at building credit. In other words, maybe look into having a bank account if you don't have one already, a credit card with a very low limit in terms of your credit, so you don't go crazy with the credit card. And as long as you keep paying it off as you're supposed to every month, that builds credit. And that's going to build sort of your portfolio as you apply for renting a place. That's going to help you in terms of getting approval to move into a place and get approved. So I mentioned social security numbers. If you don't have a social security number, no worries. Under the law, you're still protected. And so particularly for our international students and for our undocumented students, doesn't mean you can't rent. You absolutely can. If you find yourself, if this applies to you, particularly for international students and undocumented students, if you have a landlord who's saying that you have to pay an extra deposit because you don't have a social security number or something, reach out to Student Legal Services. Maybe we can sort of talk about how to handle that situation. Under the law, a landlord can get in a lot of trouble if they're treating folks with social security numbers differently compared to folks without social security numbers. So in other words, it exposes them to potential claim of discrimination if they're treating folks differently. So reach out to Student Legal Services if that's an issue.
John,
Yes.
not to interrupt, but I do have the PDF version of your slides. If there were any more slides that you definitely wanted to go over, and I can share my screen.
I was about to ask that you do that. Can you go to
can you see this?
Go to page. Nope, I can't see anything. This is very exciting.
Really?
I can't see a thing. But if you go to slide 8, that should be the looking for housing. And that kind of talks about a lot of the stuff that I've talked about. Do you have that pulled up?
I do. I'm
Cool.
currently sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Nope, but I'll take your word for it. And we'll keep going. And thank you for suggesting that, Stephanie. And yeah, I've got it also on my screen, but you obviously can't see my screen. So here we go.
So strange.
Very, very strange. landlords might, like old applications, might ask you for your bank account number. Do not give them your bank account. Okay, there's no need for them to have that. Yes, you can write the name of your bank and the phone number, the address of your bank. But giving them your bank account number is, to me, a little too much information when you're applying for a place. Now, of course, a lot of times nowadays, payments are made online. They might have your bank account information because there's an online payment portal that you're going to have to enter that information. But that's once you've signed the lease, right? So keep that in mind. One other thing that I think is really important to consider on this slide is consider getting renter's insurance. Okay, some places are going to require renter's insurance. In other words, some places will say you have to have renter's insurance in order to live at this place. So that's just a matter of shopping around, getting on the internets and looking around, and so in terms of finding renter's insurance, getting renter's insurance, there are different sort of types of coverage that come with renter's insurance. The two most basic ones are personal property and liability. So personal property insurance is basically insurance that covers you in case of loss, theft, or damage to your stuff, to your personal property. And so you get to choose how much you want in coverage, 25,000 or 50,000, or in other words, you kind of have to do some math and figure out how much all your stuff that you have at the place is worth, and then get that much coverage. And in terms of proving ownership over things in case you need to make a claim, it's good to keep copies of receipts of the big stuff, so keep a copy of the bill for, the invoice for the laptop that you bought, or the bicycle that you own, or other sort of big ticket items. I'm really glad that I had a type of renter's insurance a few years ago when I went on vacation and came back to find that my bikes had been stolen, as well as 6 pairs of perfect condition Air Jordans. I was devastated. But since I had pictures of all my shoes, because I was not like that, I just sent those pictures to my insurance company. They actually looked on eBay for the evaluation of those shoes and then sent me a check for all of them. It was sad, but I rationalized it by thinking, okay, well, I just sold my insurance company a bunch of shoes, right? In any case, personal property insurance is good to have, and it's not very expensive, that component. The other type that landlords will require will be liability insurance. And that's basically if somebody gets hurt on the property. And most places will require that you get $500,000 in liability insurance or $1 million insurance. That sounds like a huge amount of money, but don't worry. The premium that you have to pay to have that is minimal. Most insurance policies, and some of you might actually have insurance if you live on campus now through GradGuard, that again covers liability and covers personal property insurance. And so it's, most are going to cost you a couple $100 a year, 20, $25 a month or so. And to me, it's totally worth it. And just so you know, I do not love insurance companies. I don't work for insurance companies. I'm used to suing insurance companies, as a matter of fact. But I think it's better to have it than to not have it, particularly in cases where, there's a plumbing issue and the landlord's trying to blame you and you don't think it's your fault. And the landlord's got to do, $10,000 worth of repairs to the place. And if you don't have insurance, you can be held responsible for paying, damages to a place unless you can prove that that really wasn't your fault. So that's another thing that I always mention is that you might get the best insurance that you can afford, and that can include insurance that includes, damage for plumbing issues. If there's a plumbing leak, find out what's available. Now, I don't have a particular company. A lot of students use Lemonade or GradGuard. use whatever you want, but get the best you can afford. If you already have insurance because you have a car that you drive, a lot of companies will bundle your insurance. In other words, give you a discount for buying multiple types of insurance. Get the best insurance you can afford. That's my recommendation for that. I'll go to the next slide because I know we don't have a ton of time left. Actually, I'm going to skip the next two slides and go straight to security deposits, if you don't mind. So that would be slide number 11, Stephanie, if you're following at home. So the good news about security deposits is they're strictly regulated by law. It's a California statute that talks anything and everything about it. Civil Code section 1950.5, if you're just dying to know. A security deposit, by the way, is an amount of money that a tenant pays a landlord at the beginning of the lease, and that the landlord holds on to. And at the end of the lease, the landlord is supposed to give that security deposit back to the tenant. That's different, by the way, from a holding deposit. A holding deposit is an amount of money that a tenant pays to a landlord to basically secure the place and have the landlord not rent it out to anybody else. So a holding deposit is pretty common. I mean, you might have paid a holding deposit to UCSD when you thought about enrolling here. But basically, it's a potentially non-refundable amount of money. Say, you find a place in June, but the lease isn't going to start until the fall quarter begins in September. So you can enter into an agreement in June with the landlord, where basically you pay the landlord, $500, say, and in exchange for that payment, the landlord promises to you that they're going to have a space available for you in September. And a lot of times, assuming they hold up their end of the bargain, a lot of times the landlord will apply that $500, to your first month's rent or something like that. So that's a holding deposit. They can be non-refundable in the sense that if you pay them and the landlord does what they're supposed to do under that agreement, they're going to keep your money. A security deposit is different. There's no such thing as a non-refundable security deposit or any portion of a non-refund of a security deposit. And that statute that I mentioned previously, 1950.5 of the California Civil Code, it specifically says that no part of a security deposit can be considered non-refundable. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that if there is a clause in your lease that says there is an automatic $125 cleaning fee, right? That's actually unenforceable, at least that portion of that agreement. So yes, you presumably can get all of your money back. The issue is leaving it in the same condition as you found it. There is a maximum amount the landlord can charge you. That's twice the security deposit for an unfurnished place. That's twice the monthly rent, I should say, for an unfurnished place. A lot of places will charge you 1 month's rent, but yes, places are allowed to charge you twice the monthly rent as a security deposit. And they can only use your security deposit for three things: to make repairs for damages that you, your roommates, or their guests caused while you were living there, for cleaning, to get the place back in the condition it was when you moved in, and number three, for any rent that is owed and hasn't been paid. If you go to the next slide, Stephanie, which again, I'll trust that you do it. I can't see it, but this is the single most important slide in my little presentation here. Feel free to screenshot it, whatever. Protect your security deposit. And the best way to do it is to document the condition of the place as soon as you move in. Before you move a single stick of furniture, go through the whole place and make sure to document the condition of the place. Take pictures of any damages. Do the same thing when you move out. So the two best ways to document the condition are, number one, take photos of everything, take pictures. And number two, use an inspection checklist. That's something that your landlord, a document, a piece of paper that your landlord will provide to you that you basically fill out to identify to identify any problems or issues that you see. Or you can actually get you can bring your own inspection checklist. If you go to our homepage, sls.ucsd.edu, you'll see on the homepage towards the bottom, there's a hyperlink to inspection checklist, and you'll see that it sort of outlines different parts of a residence: the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, the living room, and then it'll have columns. There'll be one column which is what you fill in, that says, upon move in. So that's where you fill out and identify any problems that you see when you move in. There's also the next two columns are what the landlord fills out in the process of moving out. So in terms of the pictures, we have this little, if you're looking at the slide, we have this little trick that we recommend. Actually, so take pictures of everything, actually print out those pictures, go to, Rite Aid or CVS or wherever, and actually print those pictures out, and then take those physical copies of those pictures to the post office, stick them in an envelope, and then mail them to yourself, and then don't open the envelope. If you do all that, it's a lot, but if you do all that, you're going to have a perfect time capsule of the condition of the place as of the date that you took the pictures and mailed those pictures to yourself. Yes, you can take a video and upload it to YouTube. Yes, you can just upload it to the cloud on your phone. But the reason why you're doing this is if you have to go to court to try to get your money back. And I hope you never have to do that. But if you do, having physical pictures is going to be much easier to offer a judge than having to go into court and handing over your phone and explaining to the landlord how to scroll through your pictures to look at the pictures that you took of the place. So it's 3:00. I have a couple of things I'm happy to talk about, but I want to be respectful of time. So I can't see anything other than my own screen, and now I can see myself under the sea once again. Are there any questions that anybody has? If so, please feel free to speak up. I can't see the chat.
I can see the chat too, so if anybody wants to ask any questions. I know a couple people did leave a few minutes early, just had class and stuff to get to. But if anybody who's still here has any questions for John, please feel free to speak up, put them in the chat, and we can get those answered for you.
And I apologize for the technical difficulties. I swear this never happened. I don't know what's going on. My Zoom is open. I can't close it. I can't see Zoom. It's just a little square.
No worries. Sorry this is happening. But it doesn't seem like anybody has any questions. So unless you have any last thoughts for us.
No, other than that, as I said, reach out to us before. Reach out to us before you sign a lease. Reach out to us earlier. The earlier, the better in terms of how to resolve the situation. And as I said, if there's a problem with a landlord or with roommates, try to keep everything in writing. And before you make a decision to say move out without and stop paying your rent, even if it's in the middle of a long-term lease, come talk to Student Legal Services before you do that, because that could have some severe financial consequences. All right.
Thank you so much, John. And I did drop your phone number and then the email just for the Student Legal Services in the chat if anybody wants to get in contact with you later.
Sounds good.
I do actually have a question that just popped up.
Please.
And it was, what would you suggest doing if your landlord doesn't speak English?
Tricky. That is, it's interesting because, a couple legal things come to mind in terms of a contract has to be in the writing that it was in the language that it was negotiated. In terms of maybe communicating with a landlord, if you don't speak the same language, I use Google Translate, which is not great, but it's the best tool that I know. Yeah, I unfortunately I don't have a better solution than that, other than, as I said, to try to put things in writing so that you sort of, if there are any sort of issues that come up that might be, an issue of being lost in translation or something. Get it in writing, and maybe be thorough when you're communicating with a landlord to try to sort of suss out, to try to figure out any discrepancies in the translation, but do it in writing.
Great. They said thank you in the chat since I know you can't see that. But other than that, it is now 3:05. So I think we're good to sign off. Thank you so much again for joining us today. And if anyone has any questions, you can't find John's email, you can always email us at 2IE and we can get that over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks y'all for
Thank
having me.
you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great weekend or week.
I wish. Wait, it's Tuesday.